Hello, my name is Emily, and thank you for joining us for the second instalment of Care Conversations. Before Jan, our chair of the Workhouse Network, introduces the session properly, I just want to go over some practicalities. We are recording this session to be later hosted on our website. However, your video and microphone are automatically turned off, so you will not be shown. Please use the chat function for any comments, and please change the recipients to all panels and attendees so everyone can see your comments. And please use the Q&A button for any questions to our panelists. Both buttons for these functions can be found at the bottom of the screen. So without further ado, on to Jan.
One, 101, turn the mic on, Jan. Good morning, welcome, and thank you for sparing your Saturday morning, an hour on your Saturday morning to hear us talk about care in the workhouse context. And thank you for Emily for her superb engineering skills on this event. So this session is about learning disability, and we have Rachel Sharpe who's going to talk to us in a little while. I thought I would just introduce really what this project is about. So the history of the workhouse system, and more importantly the people who lived and worked there, have something to tell us about the centuries they inhabited, and that their views and practices can also put the present into a critical light, hence contributing, we hope, to its transformation. These Care Conversations events will, over the next 3 weeks, next 2 weeks now, approach the encounter between contemporary issues such as homelessness, learning disability and mental health, and the histography of the workhouse system, the poor law that legitimised the process, poor law boards and guardians that maintained it. We will do this by exploring the stories of people who are living through the experience of poverty, health and disability, recognising similar stories from the period of the workhouse of the 1820s to 1948 welfare state. We are not aiming to solve anything or directly compare, say, vagrants and homelessness, or the experience of 1820s learning disability, idiots from birth, which was the title. And you will, through this event, hear some words that are very derogatory terms now, but come from a classification of learning disability in the 19th century and unfortunately into the 20th century. I think that gives a perspective of this particular history from the workhouse. So we want to explore both and find commonality and genuine ways to work with contemporary issues surrounded by these issues, poverty and disability, etc. So it's with great pleasure that I'm here going to introduce Rachel Sharpe, who I've worked with, who has supported me, who does such fantastic and excellent work in really engaging people, not just with learning disability, but opening the ways that learning disabled people can teach us stuff about the world and their perspective. So over to Rachel.
What an introduction, Jan. I hope I don't let you down now. I was absolutely delighted to be asked to be part of this event. I've watched with great admiration the work that's been done at the workhouse. I think it's really important, not only as a historical site, but to the future. So it's great to be here. I'm probably going to let you down on the technical side, but I'm going to share something to start off with. Pray God it shares. And what I thought I would do, because I spoke yesterday with Emily and Jan about what you're doing as a group and how you're working. So I thought it might be useful for you to look at some examples that are online that you can access yourselves as well. So I'll start a little bit by just saying I'm Rachel. I work for the National Trust, and I'm going to speak from a professional and a personal perspective today. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the work that's been done in South Worcestershire National Trust, and some of the work that I've done as a volunteer with the RSA. So I'm just going to share my screen really quickly. Hoping this is the one that comes up. Yeah, so can you see my screen, Jan? Excellent. Thumbs up from Jan. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a project called Potter and Ponder, which is quite an old project now, but we're working at Croom in South Worcestershire for the National Trust on the second part. The first part was funded by the Heritage Lottery Fund, and we worked with children who have profound learning and health needs to find a way to create an experience for all that come to Croom. And we had a fantastic time. It was part of the Capability Brown 300, because Crooms has an incredible Capability Brown landscape, and we wanted to find ways to access the sensory parts of this world. So who better to work with than people who have a learning or health need and are complete experts in sensory exploration. So we worked with 35 children. If you're interested to find out more, this is our website I'm showing you. With 35 children, and this is one of my favourite pictures. We're not meant to have favourite pictures, but this is one of mine. And these are our experts, and our experts came to the site and we just asked them to experience it, and we followed them and we noted their moments of joy. The whole project was about mapping the children's joy and how they experienced the Capability Brown landscape. And the teachers and the carers and the key workers and the parents were absolutely central to this process. So the children we were working with, most of them didn't have language, or spoken language, should I say. So we needed those teachers to translate that world for us, and they created some amazing ways of working that I'll come on to in a bit, but these were the moments on site. And here you can see these very intense supportive relationships between children and their staff, and finding ways to think about how we might translate that for our visitors. And we worked with, and I'm just going to try and show you this. So this is the map the children in the end created. Is it going to come up? Oh, fantastic. So the children's experiences were translated into a map, and this is actually our most downloaded map at Croom and has been since 2016, or pretty sure, yeah, so it's 2016. Also on site, this map is used by a lot of visitors. It was a map created by people with learning disabilities, importantly for everyone. And here you see all of our experts, those children, all of their ideas translated into these amazing illustrations and places where you can experience the sensory world. And these illustrations and permissions to work in a different way and be in a different way through the sensory world were put together and created by, and I'm just going to try and go back here. Yes, it's gone back, that's great. By an incredible artist called William Hannacombe. William is an artist with Outside In, which is an organisation who work with artists who identify as having a learning or a health need. And the children commissioned William, and that's really important that this process was led by our experts. And I should reveal here that from a personal perspective, my own son was one of those children. So this is Stanley, and I smile when I see this picture, and I said to Jan before, he's really annoyed in this picture actually. So Stanley here would have been about 5 or 6, I suppose. He's 12 now, and Stanley is one of the most profoundly autistic people in the world. They've held symposiums about Stanley and his learning needs in places like Switzerland as part of the educationists who have worked with him. I'm immensely proud of Stanley and immensely proud of all he has achieved, but Stanley needs support to achieve that. And I see it as my responsibility as a parent and also a professional to use whatever power I have and whatever platform I have when it's appropriate and when I can to communicate about Stanley's world and communicate about carers' worlds as well, which is a place I never expected to navigate. No one ever does. And so many millions of people will have to navigate that space, which is fraught with all sorts of political, social, emotional, financial needs. And Jan asked me to speak about this, and Jan and I have talked an awful lot about learning disabilities and care. And one of the things that Jan asked me to share today, and I'm just going to swap to my next page. Has it come up, Jan? Has it changed? Brilliant. Is the onset of COVID. So when we started way back, and probably in the end of 2019, when there was mention of a virus, mention of a pandemic, mention of, I think lots of people just, oh no, this is going to blow over. In the care community, I don't think many of us felt like that. We have been consistently vulnerable to things. My son is consistently vulnerable to situations and to viruses. So as soon as we heard it, we're like, oh, this is a worry, this is a fear. And then as time moved on, and it became obvious very quickly that things were very, very serious across the globe, we had to make a decision a few days before the first lockdown. Stanley, we are incredibly fortunate that Stanley goes to a school called Sunfield in Kent. They are, it's run by Ruskin Mill Charity. They are world leading experts in working with autism. And I say with all honesty that Sunfield saved my child's life. Before Sunfield, Stanley was a very unhappy young man. Stanley's been at Sunfield since he was 5. He's actually one of their youngest children that ever went there. We fought quite a difficult battle early on to get him there, and they changed him. Before Stanley went to Sunfield, I hadn't seen him smile for a year, and his smile came back pretty much immediately when he was there. And the whole of their care package is around the sensory needs of a child and putting the child at the centre of all care situations. So Stanley's been there since he was 5. He has actually been a residential student since he was 7. So Stanley lives at Sunfield from Monday to Friday, coming home on a Friday evening and coming back on a Monday morning. And we understand that as Stanley gets older and his care needs become more, that will increase. But we are incredibly fortunate. I have utter faith and confidence in Sunfield, and this was certainly proven during those 24 hours where we had to make a decision of what was going to happen. So around our therapeutic family that involves Stanley's carers, his teachers, the senior leaders there, and us as his family. So there's me, there's his dad Adrian, his sister Connie, who's 16. We had to make a decision about where Stanley was best placed. And we knew that if we made the decision for Stanley to be at home with us, that would be about us and it would be about our needs. So with that Stanley staff, we made the decision for Stanley to stay at school, and we knew that was going to be hard. So we didn't see Stanley for 3 months at all. And because Stanley can't tolerate screens or wouldn't understand conversations across the telephone, we couldn't phone him. Now, I say that, and what I'd like to put to people is, imagine this is your 11-year-old child, whoever your 11-year-old child is, and suddenly you face the situation that you cannot see them, you cannot hold their hand, you cannot communicate with them in any way how that would feel, and not knowing how long that is going to be. And the feeling of isolation and fear is not diminished just because your child is learning disabled. It's heightened because they are far more vulnerable. But I was so lucky in that Stanley's carers are just the most amazing people I've ever met in my life. And I'm going to just tell you about one of those people. Her name is Sue. This is going to sound really strange, but Sue's home is in the south of France. So she has been for years living at Sunfield for a amount of time, and then going home and then coming back. And so she's one of Stanley's key supporters. She made the decision to stay in this country and to support my child, to make sure that he didn't miss that connection, and hasn't seen her husband since. So there are just some of the most amazing people that are in this sector, and the level of sacrifice that those people have given during this time. And I'm thinking of other people in Stanley's home setting who, you know, they couldn't be near their own families, and they couldn't, they had to live in a very different way to ensure that our families were safe. And one of the things I did here, so you feel very powerless in those moments, very powerless. And I just thought, how can I use my platform to communicate a contemporary issue? But also I made a decision very, very early on, when it became obvious what Stanley's needs were going to be, that I was going to use my platform where possible for positivity. So as I'm also an RSA counsellor, a Royal Society for the Arts, it's a voluntary role, and we were creating an experience online about how to best engage when you can't engage physically, and we utilised something called Street Wisdom. It's incredible. You can download a podcast, and it's a way of thinking about change, way of thinking about something that you're going to do, and you move through this podcast, and you go on a walk, and you utilise the street or the surroundings you're in to help you understand what it is you know anyway. But I utilise this experience to blog about my own experience as a carer. I understand from lots of conversations that it's always scary to talk about care. It's always scary to talk about personal situations because people are genuinely worried they're going to offend or upset. But I'm from the mind, it doesn't matter. You know, we can learn new ways of speaking. The real danger is the vacuum and not talking about these issues. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen there and come back to Jan.
Thanks, Rachel. It's just so moving to hear you talk about that therapeutic family, the dedication of yourself and your family, and that therapeutic wider family, and how we might think of things changing. And obviously today we were due to have Julie Kirk here from Cordwell House, which is a learning disabled looked after service run by the local authority, and is on our historic site at Southwell Workhouse. She wasn't able to navigate the NT. It has defeated us, unfortunately. So what I'm hoping to do is to talk to Julie separately, and we'll put that as a recording that runs alongside this from on the website as her perspective as a worker in a very different setting to the one Rachel is describing. I thought that maybe I should put a little bit of context around historic context into this, and then we'll have our conversation. I've got my eye on the time, and considering that in terms of institutionalized history, this is sort of 200 years worth of information. I will be reading some of it, so if I take my eyes off the screen, you know, that's why. So labelling, statementing, process, power, advocacy, those are the things that kind of come out, I think, as strong themes. And what is the historical genealogy for those things? So the last 200 years have seen societal attitudes towards people with learning disability evolve, and I use evolve carefully rather than progress, so bearing that in mind. This has occurred in various ways as a result of developments in science, nursing care, professionalisation, medical professionalisation in nursing care, and culture. And I think here we also need to acknowledge the negative pseudoscience of eugenics, and also the media in both its negative and positive efficacy. So a short history of learning disability in 2 minutes. Here we go. Hold on to your seats. 1834, new poor law. All the people in workhouse history, yeah, we know that. So was passed, and poor law unions take over the existing ad hoc poor law commission provision. That network is a public county institutions, and that's the moment we start to think around institutionalisation. In 1847, the Charity for the Asylum of Idiots is established. And as I warned earlier, there are words in here that you may find difficult. So it's a labelling and a distinction. In 1886, the Idiots Act is insisted on as a care, education and training of idiots and imbeciles, and the close relationship in the categorization of mental health and learning disability. To be fair to this particular act, there's an attempt to separate those two issues, mental health and learning disability. And there is a separation of care in that. In 1890, the Lunacy Act England and Wales bases mental health law and it exists until 1959. This act and this law is created, but it muddles again between learning disability and mental illness. In 1900, there's 13 years now, sees a development of institutionalised care, which removed idiots, epileptics, imbeciles and feeble-minded and defective persons from society. And it's a constant framework, revisiting. There is an argument that links it to Charles Darwin, and I would say it's a misinterpretation of Charles Darwin. There are other views of that, but it's certainly around the education. Eugenics Education Society was founded in 1907. So this group, this thinking is incredibly influential throughout and is coming clearly from a particular status in society, a particular educated group in society. Leading figures included a woman called Mary Dendy, who institutionalisation of mentally handicapped people in the colonies was a framework that she started to introduce. In 1913, you have a Mental Deficiency Act, and that's a proposed institution separation. And so mental defectives should be taken out of the workhouse and prison and placed in the newly established colonies. So that act is a framework to start that process. And actually, it's the 1914 war that holds that back. In 1930, there's the Eugenics Society again, Committee for Legalising Sterilisation. It's the Ministry of Health in 1934 created a legal framework to begin the process of delivering a sterilisation programme, specifically aimed, along with other what they saw as inherited. So poverty was inherited, alcoholism was inherited. There's a whole group of what they see as people who need to be not producing children, and people with learning disability are part of that. So the Second World War staved that process off. In 1948, the mental welfare officer role was produced and they were there to handle both mental health and learning disability. So an actual role was created, and in 1944, just before that, the Education Act provides special educational treatment and the introduction of special schools. So we see a change after the war, after the Second World War, of how, and there's lots of academic studies begin to happen and looking at these differences and how you categorize these differences. So 1959 replaces that 1890 Act mental health and learning disability, which makes a distinction between the two things, an active distinction. In the 1960s, we changed mental health. Irving Goffman, we may have all heard of Irving Goffman, the book Asylum, the sociological examination of institutions. It's a very famous book, and it starts to that process of thinking around institutions and what they do to people. I would say Foucault and other thinkers are thinking about crime and punishment and asylums and institutions in a different way, but all that thinking is happening from the 50s on. So 1970 Education Act is handicapped children, and I haven't even gone in yet to how we get from feeble-minded, idiots from birth, lunatics, imbeciles, to mentally handicapped. And we now think of mentally handicapped as quite a derogatory term as well. Spastics is another one that came sort of moved into those derogatory terms. And just as an aside, I think one day we will look at learning disability and think, what was that about? So 1970, yeah, we get the education handicapped children, and that says it moves children with learning disability out of ineducatable category. So they obviously had a category up till 1970 that said these people, you can't educate them, you can't change them. So 1986, the Disabled Persons Act, which is an assessment of finally gets representation for people with learning disability into the system. So it isn't until 1986 that people with learning disability can vote, can be represented in Parliament. So 1989, Caring for People Community Care Act, we might all know about that, and people are supported in the community. But that sounds fabulous, doesn't it? But we're talking a particular kind of reason for that, and it's about reducing costs. And it's quite interesting in this history. Everything is about cost. Everything comes down, if you look into the depth of it, about reducing costs and how we're going to deal with this. And it's the introduction of the internal market. And successive governments have continued that internalisation of the market over the last 30 whatever years. It's the state seen as an enabler rather than a supplier of health and social care. So hence the struggles that Rachel and parents like Rachel and carers and workers struggling to get the amount of resources that they need to actually fulfill what is in the law. So the law is there, but the will is not quite there. So 2001, the Special Educational Needs and Disability Act 2001, it gives legal rights, finally, full legal rights. And so I'll leave it at 2001. There may be other bits that other people say, oh, well, there's this. I just wanted to give you a flavour of that journey that people with learning disability and the people who care for them and the people who want to move us into a society that's transformed, that doesn't have to have learning disability as a distinction at all. So in our project at the Workhouse, we do it different, and that was the title was from the participants who are a lot like, similarly to Rachel's project, they commissioned the artist, and they decided on the title. And it's quite funny because it's do it different, and because we're National Trust, people tried to get the grammar right, which was quite entertaining. And I said, you can't get the grammar right, it's right. So I'm going to open it up now to Rachel and I have a couple of questions, like a little bit of a conversation, and then Emily will jump in at the right time, so we don't go on for too long, to open up questions that you may have. So please put your questions in the chat if you have them. So underfunding, I suppose we could start there, where I ended. While governments have updated legal framework and help and support people with learning disability and their families and extended therapeutic families, it's frequently underfunded and difficult to access. Can you, we talked about this very similar question to last week. So how do you, how have you navigated that, and what I know?
So, and this is obviously from my very, very personal situation. I'm more than happy to share. And I often work with parents who are in a similar situation to the situation myself and Adrian faced way back. But we face it moment to moment, actually. So when, if you have a child, when you give birth to a child and it has an obvious disability, and that sounds a dreadful thing to say, and I may get some of my language wrong here, but I'm just going to be really honest.
It's a safe space.
Yeah,
it's a safe space.
If there's a very obvious disability immediately, I still think there is very little that's supportive in the scenario. There's an awful lot of conversations around medical things and all things that you never think you're going to face. And actually one of the absolute key to getting care right for someone is the advocate. If the advocate can do it, then everything else is easier for the person, not the advocate necessarily. So, and no one trains you to be an advocate for this. There is no handbook, there is no support. There are many forums, many publications. It's a sea of information. But for you as a carer, you are suddenly thrust into a world where I've got a drama degree. Very quickly, I had to have a degree in everything to do with a paediatric degree. I had to understand Stanley's, and also as well, you're working in a system that doesn't want to label. Now, my suspicion is a lot of the labels make the conversations coming up to get support slightly easier. So you as a parent do not want to label your child. You have to learn very quickly to get with the language, get with the program, fight the fight, because it is one heck of a fight. And from the moment you start, you have to advocate to doctors, paediatricians, nurses, social workers, the whole gambit. And one of the things that I always start with in the many different challenging conversations we have had to enable Stanley to have the incredible care situation he has now, I've had to learn to navigate some very challenging legal conversations.
Yeah.
And what I always do, and it was something that another mum told me to do, I have a framed photograph of Stanley and I take it out of my bag. I don't warn them I'm going to do it. It's quite large. I take it out of my bag, I put it on the side and I say, right, we're all here for this young man. Let's just get this correct, shall we? And then once I've established that, I can then have conversations where I say, are we thinking of Stanley, the person, or are we thinking of Stanley's disability? So you have to learn to navigate some very challenging conversations, because no one is going to advocate on behalf of your child.
It's interesting around advocacy. Back in the day, I had a theatre company. So we're both from, that's why we're like we are. And I was approached by local authority. I can't remember what her title was, but she wanted to put an emphasis on the council, local council, county council, for an advocate for people, for carers with learning disability. In other words, to advocate for funding from the local authority and to emphasise the issue. So we did a short piece that we performed to the counsellors at council, and we worked with families, and there was one particular woman who was prepared to come with her child, and I won't say the names, but basically the young woman, a young girl, she would roll constantly, so she was constantly rolling. And we, if you've worked with learning disability or know that, that's a constant rolling. And she was happy. She was, joining in. She was singing when we had a song and moving constantly. And her mum was constantly moving just to check she was safe and sit down. And that wasn't performed. That was clearly this woman's experience with her child as a 24/7 activity. And that's just one activity that she, one thing. And the performance, I would say, was quite good and had points to make, but it was that swung really the counsellors. And they came up and said, that was extraordinary just to watch that. And that spoke all the words, really. And I think it is so important that it's about that person.
Yes.
And those people.
Yes. And I think that's such a good point you've made there, Jan, around you have to, in order to navigate these waters, you have to believe in the good of the people on the other side of the table. And you have to find the conversation and you have to find that connection to enable them to understand. I wouldn't expect anyone to understand my experience with Stanley. Stanley sleeps about 2 hours a night. He's like Spider-Man, he can climb anywhere, and that gives him skills. But I wouldn't expect anyone to be able to shortcut into understanding that. So that experience of helping people to understand, helping the policymakers, the people who are going to, in the end, because it is the funding and the resource that enables positive care, helping them to understand the best decisions to make is important, but also helping carers to learn how to advocate for that, what they need to say, who they need to speak to, how they need to say it. And it's interesting because I was helped very early on by a service called Portage, which is a service that is home learning. So you have a home learner that comes into your home once a week when you have a child who has an additional need, and the Portage worker actually teaches you how to play.
Yes, to do the learning.
It's not just about that. Portage teaches you how to advocate on behalf of your child. And one of the things that I raised with my social worker was my concern when Portage was cut in probably 2013, 2014, because what we need to do and why projects like yours are really important is find ways to advocate, find ways to make the invisible visible. And services like Portage taught carers, certainly taught me, how to be the right sort of ambassador for their child.
Yeah, I have to say, they got their money, they had their advocacy worker, but I was thinking, how long is that going to last? And we come back to money again. And I know that through the COVID pandemic, so much has been shown, I think, that learning disability people, families, caring for them have become incredibly vulnerable because of those cuts. And it's not the pandemic, it's the austerity measures prior to the pandemic that have allowed that. And I have to say, and we've talked about this, is that kind of eugenics approach that I've talked about in this history, this very potted quick history, with the do not resuscitate, and then whether we vaccinate people with learning disability. It is hard to imagine a country that 10 years ago would never have even thought, I think, that and I think it's all those packages and charities that were supported and all those advocacy things that have been ripped out by austerity that have enabled that to happen. Would you, I know that you have personal stuff and don't feel you have to share that, but that, you know, those processes you've had to go through must have been horrendous.
I think you make a very, very important point, in that as a community, caring families, you know, as the sector, for want of a better phrase, was
it is.
Austerity put it on the ropes. So already we were weak, and we'd had a massive fight. And like I say, I feel very fortunate that the personal fight we had enabled my child, and he was supported by our council, to have the right therapeutic setting. But not everyone is in that position. So few people are. And that's the fear, because when suddenly all the it's understandable, all of the focus went onto the world. So a world that's invisible and weakened anyway, which is like, hi, we're here. And because carers so often have had to make really unusual changes to their life, I know myself and my husband, we reflected that what's changed for our lives on a weekend about COVID is fear. But actually, isolation hasn't changed.
No, right.
And we can't go anywhere on a weekend really anyway. You know, Stanley's actually 3 to 1. So there's me, my husband, and my daughter supports as well. So he needs that level of support. What has changed is the fear. And it's the fear about what the 3 of us do in the week and how we can protect him. And I've been really lucky that my employer has been incredibly supportive of my care situation, same as my husband. But it is that we're on the ropes anyway. COVID comes along, and you all of a sudden, all the conversations, and I think of friends who had so many medical appointments cut, so many support appointments.
Right, yes, of course.
That backlog, but the need has not lessened. But also as the story gets bigger, the communications got smaller. So what we need to do as a world is tell this story, so when the next pandemic comes along, we aren't seeing the figures we saw about the, you know, the level of devastation in the learning disability community.
Yeah,
and also,
I think it's really interesting. I was just thinking about the history, you know, in a personal sense. So there are a number of personal stories from our workhouse, and I'm sure others, you know, about learning disability experience within the institution and the vulnerability that people had in that institution. But the one story that sticks in my mind is actually from a project called In Their Own Right, which is Leicester University and the National Archive partnership. And Dr. Paul Carter, who works from the National Archive, has a session, and he was relating a letter that comes to, these are letters that go to the Poor Law Commission or the Poor Law central office, and apparently they're you know, floor to ceiling, 2 football fields full of these letters to work through. Amazing archive, and it is actually letters of paupers as well as official other people. And there's this guy who has got work, and he's clearly got a child that he cares for, and the child is 8 or 9, I think, as I recall, and clearly needs constant care. And therefore, you know, I can't tie her to the bedpost, which gives us an indication it's probably a child with learning disability. And he is breaking his heart to navigate and negotiate. And it's a 19th century letter to the Poor Law Commission, Poor Law Board, to try to understand what care she would get in the workhouse. Where can I place her? What will happen to her? How can I, you know, can I visit her? All sorts of questions. And he's desperately trying to get the best deal he can.
Yeah.
And I think that's what connects you then to what you're talking about, Rachel, and those systems of navigation, where we have a world where we feel we have to make distinction, make categorization. And because I'm not that kind of historian, there is an act that comes in, I believe at the beginning, sort of mid 20th century, but I think it's an Education Act in specialist schools, and people have to apply for that, and that is where statementing comes in, and where you define what it is and why you need that support. And I think that you know, you hear that guy's voice. Is that really, you know, where we want to go without all those support mechanisms? And I think you're absolutely right. You and I think, are pretty committed to continuing to use our sites as advocates for particular, not necessarily just learning disability. That is one of the amazing things about Workhouse history. It connects you. But one of the things that after our project Do It Different, was the mental health of people, the poverty of people with learning disability. They're not, as you said so clearly, they're not just their disability.
No, and that's really touched me, that man's story, because
yeah,
my experience is based on his foundation. So what we have to think is, in 100 or so years' time, what difference can the time I have make to the people who are going to be having this conversation down the road, because they are. What difference can we make? And you know, what he has done to use his power has enabled a change to support me and my child. So what can I do, and what can we do as a world to make this possible? And I think this is a very personal reflection. I have 2 children. I'm really, really lucky. They're 2 wonderful children. And my mum once said to me, and she's absolutely right, we all love children equally, but you have to have an extra bit of love as well when they need a bit more love. And
absolutely,
she's absolutely right.
Yeah.
And that love comes quite naturally. So I'm hearing him down the road in history, and I'm hearing his love for his child, his advocacy for his child. And that must have been a horrendous situation, and sadly a situation that I would imagine so many people in the world are still facing.
Totally, yeah. Rachel, thanks so much. It's been, I mean, we could go on, clearly. So to say to the audience that this recording will be on our website, coming up on the Workhouse Network website. We will, and any more information, do get in touch with the Workhouse Network, and I will either pass things on to Rachel or try and answer it myself. So over to Emily.
Hello, thank you so much to both of you for that conversation. It was really interesting, and really, for someone who doesn't actually know a lot about this subject, it was really helpful to know and understand about contemporary and past experiences. So thank you so much for that. We've had a couple of questions in the chat, but I have a question first of all, and it's mainly about I think sometimes people think that this subject can be quite a negative subject and have a lot of negative connotations to it. But I was wondering if Jan, if there's any kind of positive stories from the workhouse in the past to do with learning disability and inmates that potentially had learning disability.
I think it's really difficult to look at legal stuff. So that's when people, as you know, connect with some sort of recording of their experience, is when something's going wrong. So in both our big stories that we know these people had learning difficulties, they end up in court because they are so badly treated or they experience abuse. So everything else is a little bit conjecture to put that nuance on it of how people had a full experience. And I think that what Rachel's trying to find the joy following the joy is what we have to do. And I think it's a really good point, Emily, and it's just so embedded, isn't it, in that sort of negative expression of the workhouse. What I always say to audiences, that actually Nicola's just put up a comment there. I was just about to say what we actually know is that people with learning disability came in as children or are abandoned as disabled children at the workhouse and lived there all their lives. And if you live till you're 90, there must have been moments when it was good. There must have been things that happened that were positive. And that's as close as we get, I think. And I think it's a good point and a really great point. And I think you've got some comments coming up there. Yes. So other people with a wider knowledge than me, maybe.
Yeah, who are talking about some positive stories. If you want to look at them, they're just in the chat. Just have a little scroll through. We've got a few more questions in the Q&As. I'm just going to have a look at those now. We have an anonymous question. I think this is about the contemporary care. And it says, I'm interested in how the care is funded. Is the care free? Could someone with no funds and no money access it for their children? So I think this is a question for you, Rachel.
No care and no support is free. So in our own situation, we had to go to, we didn't quite get to tribunal. We won our case before tribunal. Any care situation, I'm not breaking any confidentiality in saying this, it's freely available on the internet, is incredibly expensive. My own child's placement is funded by our local area authority, and I would say that 99.9% of places in therapeutic settings such as I have described are funded in that way.
Okay, thank you for that. So we've got a couple more questions. One is there evidence for the good of the people responsible for care of others in the workhouse system? How did they work around the systems in the past?
Do you think you could repeat that, the first part of it, Emily?
Is there evidence for the good of the people responsible for care of others in the workhouse system? How did they work around the systems in the past?
Okay, I think there's not a dedicated the evidence of good of the people responsible for care. Okay, so I think that's a key worker kind of question, isn't it? And specific professionalisation around caring specifically for learning disability. So we know that there was an increase of professionalisation in the nursing profession for mental health, because you have asylums and you have a whole process of identifying different care and medical care, even though there's a lot of experimentation in asylums, there's a whole another layer, which I'm afraid is dark again, of history of people with learning disability being used as guinea pigs for medication and for live medicated sort of trials, because there's no one to advocate for them. And the same with mental health as well. But because mental health affects more people, affects, if I'm going to be really a little bit contentious, affects the economy of the country. Okay, so more money goes into that, more focus goes into that, as now we're talking about well-being, and you know, we're being made to feel personally responsible for our mental health at the moment, you know, so the difference is that the identity of learning disability doesn't happen until quite late on. So in terms of the workhouse in its early phases, it doesn't have any kind of differentiation. I think as Helen's just said, out relief is found to be given to families to support their families in the villages. Yes, I think so. And I think that there was a sort of process back in the 19th century of people being in their homes. We also know that people were incredibly abused. The village idiot. There's reasons for certain cultural ways. So how supported they were in out relief, which wasn't that much money, and as Rachel's made very clear, how expensive it is actually, and that wouldn't have changed, that would be the same. So I think that there's for people workers caring for people in workhouses, in the workhouse system, it probably never was identifiable as a particular professional care. So, and some people have got other information coming in there. So if the participants can see those chats, there's little nuggets coming out of this very informed audience. So they can probably add more in. But that's my understanding. And it's not until really the middle of the 20th century, 50s, that we start to see, and it's Goffman and people like that start to identify what learning disability actually is. So then you can have specific care and people who have that knowledge. I hope that's a bit rambly, but you know, big question. It's Megan's question, I noticed.
We have a couple more, mainly about the kind of differences between people who is in the past and today who are wealthy or can take on the system, and those who cannot take on the system and do not have money to be able to care for their children or their vulnerable adults. So they're kind of a similar question, but I'll go with the first one. When parents are not able to take on the system for a number of different reasons, today or in the past, how are they able to ensure their children or vulnerable adults are cared for?
Is that one to me? You have to excuse me. Since I last came off mute, Stanley's obviously downstairs, so it's beautifully loud here. I'm hearing some wonderful shrieks. You might not hear them. Really good question, and the question that keeps me up at night and will do for the entirety of my life is around, I mean, most of my working life I've worked in communities through creativity, and most of my working life I have worked with people whom organisations or places find hard to reach, and the vulnerability of those people is something that keeps me up at night. So it's a very difficult question. I do remember in the very early stages of our fight, and I use that word a lot, someone saying to me, oh gosh, Stanley's really lucky to have you two. And I didn't feel he was lucky at all at the time. I felt completely phased by the whole system. But then you realise it and you go, actually what Stanley was lucky for was that both my husband and I have the ability to navigate things. And there are millions of people that don't. And the more we can do to raise people's understanding, and also I'm going to use this term in its widest sense, aspirations for their young person. The biggest fear for me is when I have conversations with carers and it's like, oh, well, that's all we can get. That's all that will happen. That's all they can be. No, that isn't what we would say for other people. We would say if you put in the right environment, the right opportunities, that person can grow, and that's the same for everyone. So what happens to those people who don't have the ability is they are doubly vulnerable, and the more we can do to raise people's aspirations and understanding of their own advocacy and support them to do that, the better the world will be.
Mm-hmm. That's great, thank you, Rachel. There's been a follow-up question as you were speaking, actually, for you as well. How do parents find ways to continue to care for their children after their death? How do we, or did we, manage this transition?
After the parent's death. Wow. Whoa, that's a big question.
It is a very big question.
Keeps me awake at night. A really important one. When you realise your child is always going to be vulnerable, that is the first thing you think of. You think of what happens after I'm gone. And that, I think that gives you a different kind of strength, because it's not just about now, it's about the future when I'm not here. So it makes you think you have to future-proof. I'm very clear with my daughter, who's incredibly supportive of us, that I do not expect her to continue care after myself and my husband are gone. I think she will do that, but I don't expect her to do that. Actually, what my focus is how can I change the system so people don't have to worry about that.
That's great. That's a brilliant answer. Thank you for being so open and honest answering that one. It's quite a difficult one to think about. There's a last question, and I think this is more for you, Jan, but feel free to weigh in, Rachel. Is there a difference between the way wealthy and poorer individuals were cared for in the past? Were wealthy individuals with learning difficulties, or did wealthy individuals with learning difficulties receive a better quality of care?
Well, it's a good question, because I hope with the history timeline I've shown you, the cultural, which we haven't talked a lot about this, but the cultural attitudes towards people with learning disability, it's a bit like domestic violence. It doesn't have an economic kind of, people who with less money are more prejudiced than people with more money. Okay, yeah, the prejudice and the unconscious bias goes right through the societal. So we know from literature, that there are certainly people from the upper class who put their children into asylums because they didn't fit, they weren't able to. We have a story from our own royal family where two learning disabled children were put into care and put away and made completely invisible, and in the 50s. So they're Down syndrome twins, I think. I think, this is the family that we're supposed to model ourselves on. So that's interesting. So I think that putting someone into care, whether those people would then pay extra for the extras you could have, to more food, better, maybe individual sleeping arrangements. I can't imagine that in our work, to be fair, but it may be in an asylum. Rachel's actually was telling me yesterday about Elgar and the fact that he was in an asylum and wrote a lot of his music in an asylum. So asylums were slightly different. So, and mental health is we have a different relationship to it. Culturally, it can be you're a genius and artistic and close to madness. You don't hear that said about people with learning disability, unfortunately. More so now. Yeah, Rachel.
That's a really good point you make. And when we were talking about Elgar, so Elgar himself wasn't in an asylum, but he taught in an asylum.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, sorry.
So it's okay. He taught at Powick Asylum. Well, he created music at Powick Asylum, so he learned his skill really fast there. It was a type of music therapy, and it's interesting to think historically about what his interest was, because he didn't have a connection with the learning disability community, but he was connected. But when you look at Elgar's later life, he was so connected to the outdoors and being moved in order to create his artwork that you see there the correlations with his own mental health and the lessons he learnt whilst being in that situation. I think there's some really interesting people across history who have been their skill has been enabled by contact with people who have an additional need. I think one of the most interesting things, just going back to that question about wealthy people, etc., might be really interesting to research more contemporary history with David Cameron and his own son, who was profoundly disabled, but at the same time Cameron was making decisions around, what that became austerity. So it'd be really interesting to do some research around who you are as a carer and how that affects the decisions you make for others. Might be an interesting starting point.
What's interesting in the chat is Megan's put up that we have a story of a lady whose daughter paid for her to join her in Australia and got her out of the system. So I think where people can put finances in to effect change, they will do that. I think that you know, as Rachel said, we need more research around what differentiation, whether there was some sort of paid system in which people could give money to the guardians for their child to be looked after, or their relative to be looked after better than others. So you know, I think money does always talk. It always speaks. You know, it gives people more opportunity than poverty. But learning disability, people in the past with extreme poverty dissipates learning disability, shortens life of people with learning disability. That's for sure. That's proven.
A couple of comments I just want to read out from the chat that I thought were quite interesting. So from Nicola, we have, there was separate inspection of how a workhouse used funds allocated for those labelled as imbeciles, etc.
Yeah.
Difficult to know how humane this was, or whether it was just a check on funding, but at least indicates some recognition of need for oversight. And then Richard, who I believe is a researcher, he says there was no difference in treatment of patients of different wealth in the Norfolk County Asylum in the 19th century. So a little bit of insight there from one asylum.
Yeah. I think it's interesting where that information comes from. And I think that institutions operate in different ways as well. So in terms of asylums, but in terms of workhouses, there's always the opportunity for people when we know that workhouses were underfunded. So they're always looking for ways to make money or to ease that money burden. So whether you might bend the rules and take money from people to supplement their care in the workhouse, well, it needs research. So I shouldn't say, yes, that would definitely happen. But we know there were cases of discrepancy in financial terms.
Cool, thank you. And that's the end of the questions and comments.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Rachel. It's been really interesting, and such a full story from you and your advocacy work. And I know we will, and the network will work more closely with you, and we want to pick your brain about some of those sort of processes, that contemporary processes that and organisations we can link up with, because that's one of the purposes of this. So thanks so much.
Yeah, absolute pleasure.
And thank you, Emily. Superb as ever, smooth. I can see you have a future on local radio, you know, national radio, actually, what I'm talking about. Really cool. Thank you very much. And thank you everyone who came and for questions, and great, another great session. Thanks very much.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye.